All right, and we are recording. Okay. With my introduction and the introduction of the foundation, I would also like to say that I will be muting everybody as they come in. Please remain muted throughout this program. And later on in the program, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, just shoot them in the chat and we can address them later with Deveney at the end of the program. Or at the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask Deveney questions specifically. So I would also like to read the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation's land acknowledgement at this moment in time. We gratefully acknowledge Native peoples who have lived on this land for millennia. Their dedication to the land and to their communities runs deep within the hearts of those past, present, and future. This dedication encourages the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation to continue developing among diverse communities an understanding of and an appreciation for the commitment of Native peoples to this nation and the significance of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And with that, I will also be introducing our presenter tonight. So tonight's presenter is Deveney Reber. She is studying history and German at Brigham Young University and will graduate in April of 2022. She is currently a research student with Dr. J. Buckley at the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, researching the life of Reuben Lewis. Deveney lived most of her life in Switzerland, but her family currently lives in England. She became interested in history because in Europe, everything is decades, if not centuries old, and she wanted to know all of the stories of the places she lived in. When Deveney moved to the States, she was only 16. Because of that, American history is still somewhat new and exciting, and she has been diving into the history during her time at BYU. Please join me in welcoming Deveney to present on the forgotten brother of Meriwether Lewis, Rueben, the talented fur trader and Indian agent along the Missouri.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. It is quite surreal to be sharing my research with you all. For anyone who has done any research, they know that researching can be a bit of a lonely endeavor sometimes. Over the past 2 years now, while searching archives alone, or reading books alone, or trying to decipher 200-year-old handwriting alone, I would often wish for some human contact. I now see that I should be careful for what I wish for. But luckily, Zoom takes a bit of the edge off of public speaking, and I'm really grateful today to share with you a relatively unknown aspect of the Lewis and Clark story, Meriwether's younger brother, an exciting and influential figure in his own right, Reuben Lewis. Before I get started, I would really like to thank the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, Burroughs Holland Education Fund, the Portage Route chapter of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation for funding my research. Because of their contributions, I've been able to travel up here to Montana, where I've been able to access the William P. Sherman Library, and also be going to Virginia and St. Louis later this year. And I'm just very grateful for their support in my research. So for me, this story starts in an 8 a.m. history class. Kind of exciting place for a story to start. I was taking American history from Dr. J. Buckley at Brigham Young University, and for some reason he liked my writing. My guess is that our class was small, so we didn't have too many options. J. Buckley is the former president of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and he told me that he had a project for me. He had a lot of information about the brother of Meriwether Lewis and wanted me to research Meriwether's brother and write an article about him. As Sarah pointed out, I didn't grow up in the United States, so at the time I had a very vague understanding of who Meriwether Lewis or Clark, I wasn't sure which one was which, let alone that he had a brother of any importance. And then Dr. Buckley gave me literally 2 crates of information gathered by a woman named Jane Henley in Virginia about Reuben Lewis. Here are some pictures of some of the documents that I found in those crates. We had some primary sources like this receipt here. Honestly, still not sure what that's for. Some of her notes, some other articles, and important information and letters that really helped me get a sense of who Reuben was. But it was still difficult for me to piece together the life of someone I had never met. Met or heard of. It'd be difficult to meet him since he was born in, 1777. I went to other resources as well. The Brigham Young University Library helped me find a whole bunch of secondary sources that helped me understand the context of the fur trade, the Lewis and Clark expedition, Native American United States relationships. I also was able to access a master's thesis by Andrea Radke about Reuben Lewis that pointed me to some sources to use for my own research. Thanks to some very helpful and patient librarians at the Missouri Historical Society and the University of Virginia Library, I was also able to get some primary documents such as letters or journals of men who had traveled with Reuben and wrote about him. And I slowly started piecing together the life of Reuben Lewis, the brother of Meriwether Lewis. Here is an example of some of that piecing together process. I was trying to figure out where Reuben even was at certain times in his life. There's just so little content about him, perhaps because he hides a bit in the shadow of his famous older brother. And here's some of my research trying to figure out just where he was at certain times in his life so I could learn what to say about him. I really wish I had a picture to show you of Reuben, but there aren't any. It's kind of strange to get to know someone living or dead for so much time and not even know what they look like. And as I came to research him, I realized that he truly was a very dynamic character. The more I learned about the beginning of his life, the less I liked him. And the more I learned about the end of his life, the more I liked him. I think he truly is a symbol of the early 19th century American frontiersman, with all the parts of American history that we admire and all the parts that perhaps make us a little bit uncomfortable. He was a slave owner. He swindled men for his own personal gain in the fur trade. But he was also brave. He not only survived, but prevailed in some of the most notoriously dangerous parts of the frontier. He served as an Indian agent. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a government official that acts as a middleman between the US government and a certain Native American tribe. And later in life, he stood up for slave rights and Native American rights. And in the end, he gave up all of his attained power and prestige to come home and take care of a family that had quite the tendency to fall apart. I am honored today to share his story with you. The first part of his story might sound a little familiar to any Meriwether Lewis fans because the two grew up very close in both age and friendship. They're only 2 years apart, and from the letters that I have read between the two of them, they seem to be good friends. They had a loving and somewhat humorous relationship. Reuben liked to make fun of Meriwether sometimes. Here's a letter from Meriwether to Reuben. He always signed them, "I'm your ever affectionate, loving brother," and reminded Reuben almost a nagging amount of times to make sure and write him. They were both born in Albemarle County in Virginia, and they both experienced a bit of a fractured childhood. They were born on Locust Hill, a plantation that was 1,000 acres in size, and the family had 25 slaves. Here is the best picture I could find of it. It's just a little illustration of it from the time period. And they grew up only 10 miles west of Monticello, the famous Thomas Jefferson homestead. And the two families were family friends. Thomas Jefferson, in his classic poetic style, once wrote about Albemarle County, where they were both from, "Where has nature spread so rich a mantle of under her eye?" Classic Thomas Jefferson poetry right there. Despite being so beautiful and in nature, it was not quite safe from the Revolutionary War. And when the British surrendered at Saratoga in October of 1777, 4,000 British soldiers were housed at barracks near Reuben and Meriwether's house. Within 3 years, 2,000 of them had escaped, so not a great retention rate. And some of them came to harass the Meriwether and Reuben family. And Lucy, their mother, according to family lore, single-handedly drove them off with the rifle that she grabbed off the family mantle. So quite a strong woman and quite a strong family. Tragedy struck in 1779 when Meriwether and Reuben's father, William, died. The prevailing narrative that has been told by most Meriwether Lewis historians is that their father, William, died while returning to his post in the Continental Army. He was visiting his wife and little children in November 1779 and chose to return through a swollen river. His horse was swept away from beneath him and he died of pneumonia just 10 miles from home. As I said, that is the prevailing narrative that has been retold in most histories that I've read. Aaron Flick of Norco College, however, in California, has been doing some really interesting research that challenges this narrative. He has concluded from his research that there is actually no record of William, Meriwether and Reuben's father, being in the Army anytime after 1776, and so it was not possible that he was returning to his post on that day in 1779. Aaron Flick has also conducted some research into the daybook of the neighborhood physician and found that William was suffering from multiple physical and mental ailments that may have led to his death. I just saw that his article about this was most recently published in the most recent version of We Preceded On, the journal published by the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. So if you're interested in learning more about this new history, you are welcome to read that. Either way, Lucy, now the single mother of 3 children, moved with her new husband, John Marks, to the Broad River in Georgia. John Marks also died relatively soon after that. It seemed the family just couldn't catch a break. Meriwether and Reuben wrote often during this time because Meriwether stayed in Virginia to continue his schooling. He wrote Reuben that he was jealous of all of Reuben's, quote, sport, fishing, and hunting, end quote, in wild Georgia. And so I find it interesting that it was Meriwether who became the famous outdoorsman when Reuben actually had much more exposure to the wild frontier than Meriwether did in childhood. The work was hard in Georgia. Reuben and his family had to convert 290 acres of wilderness into tobacco territory. And despite their distance, Meriwether and Reuben were close. And from the letters, it appears that Reuben made the 3-month round trip all the way back to Albemarle County to see Meriwether when Reuben was only 10 years old. I assume and certainly hope that he was accompanied by relatives, as many of the Lewises moved out with Lucy and John Marks when they moved to Georgia. The thing is that when William Lewis died, he left all of his belongings and land to Meriwether due to the law of primogeniture, as he was the oldest son. So Meriwether inherited the Lewis plantation, 520 pounds, 24 slaves, and 147 gallons of whiskey. I don't know what you'd need that for when you were 5 years old. When Reuben's stepfather died, he left all he had to his 2 blood children. So Reuben received no inheritance from either father. And I wonder if this is what drove him to the frontier, despite the extremely dangerous circumstances he would encounter there. He had to make a life for himself all on his own. While Meriwether was away on his expedition with William Clark, Reuben Lewis received personal updates from President Thomas Jefferson on his brother's whereabouts. They were, after all, family friends from Albemarle County. I often wonder when reading these letters if Reuben had any idea that in just a couple of years, he would be on that same Missouri River that Meriwether was describing and becoming friends with those same Native Americans that his brother was meeting. After Meriwether returned home, Reuben helped him move into his new mansion in St. Louis, one of the most western frontier towns of the time. As nice as a mansion in St. Louis must have been, Meriwether faced some serious problems upon his arrival home from the expedition. The Osage Native Americans felt cornered by white encroachment to the west and resorted to theft and in some cases killing Americans. Fur traders became increasingly hesitant to go west, and a large confederacy of other native tribes were preparing to slaughter the Osage, as they had also been attacked by the Osage Indians. Meriwether's last-ditch resort before the potential disaster was to send Reuben, William Clark, and George Sibley to build a trade post 300 miles up the Missouri and make a treaty with the Osage. And I think I have a picture of that here. There's the Osage fort. Meriwether hoped that controlling the merchandise would help him control the indigenous populations. And I think the fact that he entrusted Reuben with such a high-stakes mission with so many lives on the line shows how capable he must have perceived his young brother to be. There at Fort Osage, near modern-day Kansas City, Reuben watched what Clark later described as, quote, the hardest treaty on Indians he ever made, and that if he was to be damned hereafter, it would be for making that treaty. Clark later admitted to, quote, political manipulations that contributed to the exaggerated accusations of Osage depredations to advance American interests, end quote. William Clark extracted from the Osage land equal to the entire state of Virginia at an incredibly low cost. Reuben would one day have to deal with the shockwaves of this very treaty. Later in life, he became the Indian agent to the Cherokee as they settled the very land ceded by the Osage. With this unfair treaty being his introduction to the frontier, it would remain to be seen how he would treat Native Americans, if he would follow this precedent or not. That winter, 4,000 Native Americans came to trade at the fort, and Reuben received all the firsthand experience he needed for his next adventure. They were collecting so many furs that Sibley and Reuben actually had to suspend trade for a while because they simply did not have enough room in the fort for all the incoming merchandise. Due to his success at Fort Osage, Reuben became a partner in the Missouri Fur Company, along with an all-star group including William Clark, Pierre Menard, Andrew Henry, and the notorious Manuel Lisa pictured here in the middle. If I ever read anything in a secondary source about Reuben Lewis, it's about his involvement in the Missouri Fur Company. Usually just his name is listed with other names, and that's pretty much all I've read in any secondary source about him. So learning about this time of his life was quite difficult. The group set out to return the visiting Mandan chief, CHEROKEE, who's pictured here on my left. I'm not sure what it is for you guys. CHEROKEE had gone to Washington to meet the president and now was turning to his tribes, the Mandan tribes. They also went to open up an organized fur trade effort along the Missouri. Reuben left on this expedition completely unaware that his goodbye to Meriwether would be the last time he would ever see his brother. They left St. Louis with 125 hired trappers, 13 barges, a barge is pictured here as well, and a literal cannon in case Native Americans decided to attack the barges, which was a common enough occurrence to be concerned about. That's also depicted here in this picture. Reuben Lewis was put in charge of a barge of especially rebellious trappers, thus placing him in a difficult position between the other partners and the unhappy frontiersmen they had hired. He admittedly did not handle the situation with grace. When one of the partners commanded that the most troublesome frontiersman, James Cheek, be forced to leave the party, Reuben complied. Despite being 1,400 miles away from civilization, young Reuben not only relayed this command, but also deprived Cheek of his gun, essentially sentencing the Tennessean frontiersman to a lonesome death in the wild. The only reason the order was not followed through was because the trappers asserted their independence with their firearms. Reuben stood down because he was forced to, and no record of his sympathy remains. Reuben was given a second chance to exemplify compassion. After ordering Thomas James, another trapper, ashore to hunt for game, a great wind picked up, carrying the boats upstream. Lewis's men pleaded with him to wait for James, but they didn't. A week later, an emancipated and shoeless James finally caught up with the boats, lucky to even be alive. When the company finally reached their destination at the MANDAN villages, where the Lewis and Clark expedition had wintered 5 years earlier, the partners, including Reuben, violated their contract by leaving the hired hands without provisions or weapons to protect themselves. The trappers had to buy these necessities from the Missouri Fur Company at great cost in order to survive. Later in life, Reuben would again be the middleman between two aggrieved parties, but this time on a much larger scale, not just trappers and partners, but between the Cherokee and the U.S. government. It would appear that these youthful moral failures that we've just discussed were on his mind, because as a Cherokee agent and a part of U.S. history where so many did wrong, Reuben did right. But that would be years later. For now, Reuben was about to endure the most dangerous years of his life. Some background first. A couple of months before Reuben arrived at the Mandan villages, John Coulter and John Potts, both veterans of the Lewis and Clark expedition, were near the Three Forks in Montana on the Jefferson River when Blackfeet warriors ordered them ashore. Blackfeet Native Americans were especially notorious for being violent and attacking hunters. John Potts refused to come ashore and shot one of the natives and was in turn shot to death with arrows. John Coulter, not desiring the same fate as his companion, came ashore where he was stripped of his clothes and told to run. Once he had made it about 100 yards, the Blackfeet Indians chased after him. He overpowered the fastest Blackfoot warrior, took his spear and blanket, and hid in a beaver dam at one of the forks. Once the Blackfeet Native Americans gave up looking for him on the river, he ascended the snowy mountains with nothing but a stolen blanket and walked 300 miles to the nearest fur trade fort. He was so ragged when he arrived that people didn't recognize him until he identified himself as the famous John Coulter. Now, despite this harrowing tale, Manuel Lisa, the head of the Missouri Fur Company, knew that there were lots of beaver up at the Three Forks and wanted an expedition to go. He chose Reuben Lewis, Pierre Menard, and Andrew Henry to lead a trapping expedition up the Four Forks with about 40 men, and somehow, I'm still not sure how, convinced John Coulter to return to that very place he had just escaped from as their guide. Their expedition started out difficult and got worse. The winter was hard. The men experienced snow blindness that lasted several days in their attempts to cross the mountains to the Three Forks from the Yellowstone River. Unable to see meant that they were unable to hunt, and so Reuben and his men had to kill several of their horses and dogs in order to survive. In spring, the group built a fort outside outside those walls of the fort. Some of the trappers had some run-ins with 800-pound grizzly bears. I have a picture of one of those right here. Although they often escaped with their lives, they sometimes lost an eye or a part of their face or a limb in the process. Even more deadly were potential run-ins with natives of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Ironically, it was Reuben's brother, Meriwether, who had inadvertently caused so many issues for his younger brother down the road. On the Lewis and Clark expedition, Meriwether killed a Blackfoot warrior who was attempting to steal their horses. Relations between Blackfeet and Americans were soured for years to come. At first, prospects looked promising. The men set their beaver traps and caught a beaver in every single one. One of the people there reported that they were cheered with thoughts of making a speedy fortune. And then suddenly an entire group of French trappers never came back to the fort. Reuben and the other partners encouraged trappers to leave the fort in groups so that they would be safe. But George Drouillard, the famous navigator, interpreter, and principal hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition, claimed, and I quote, "I am too much of an Indian to be caught by Indians," end quote, and braved the Montana wilderness alone. He was found dead after using his horse as a shield from Blackfeet arrows for as long as he could. Many of Reuben's men died at Three Forks. It's unclear how many, but at least 10, but maybe up to 20 were killed by Blackfeet warriors. Even John Coulter couldn't handle any more and returned to St. Louis and never came back to the frontier. Reuben Lewis, however, stayed. Game became scarce, and the trappers were convinced that the Blackfeet were trying to starve them out. One of Reuben's men reported, "We all became tired of this kind of life, cooped up in a small enclosure in perpetual danger of assassination when outside the pickets." Also tragically, during Reuben's time in the West, Meriwether had died under mysterious circumstances, but Reuben did not know this and sent a letter to him down to St. Louis with John Coulter. Reuben wrote Meriwether that they would need 300 men to successfully trap at the Three Forks. The small group of 40 that had eventually been reduced down to just 20 was just not enough to cut it. He also asked for a copy of the Lewis and Clark expedition of the Three Forks area, knowing that his older brother's findings would be useful to him. Reuben commented that he thought the British were supporting the Blackfeet and stirring them up against the Americans, harking back to a common enemy the two brothers had shared since their boyhood, the British presence on the American continent. Unfortunately, Meriwether would never read this letter. He had already met his end on a lonely Tennessee trail 6 months prior. Eventually, Reuben and the other trappers gave up on the Three Forks, despite its prosperous beaver potential, because it was simply too dangerous to operate. But they had to even fight their way out of the fort to escape from Three Forks. They returned to Fort Mandan, where Lisa met them with a rescue mission that was a little bit too late, since the party had already rescued themselves. It was there, nearly 2 years after his brother's death, that Reuben learned that Meriwether had passed away. Reuben, knowing he was now the oldest son, raced home on the earliest boat to take care of his family and settle Meriwether's accounts. Interestingly, Lewis and Clark, as I mentioned, had spent their first winter on their expedition at the Mandan villages, and I'm sure this proximity to his brother was on Reuben's mind when he learned of Meriwether's mysterious death. In 1812, Reuben was hired as a clerk for the Missouri Fur Company and commanded his own group of 10 trappers to the Little Bighorn River. Despite being robbed by the Crow Native Americans, he amassed an impressive amount of furs. And also on that trip, he apparently captured a small prairie dog and kept it as a pet, which he was very fond of. While this adventure was safer than his Three Forks experience, the frontier was still a force to be reckoned with. Multiple men fell off their barge into the Missouri and were never seen again. Additionally, he reported a 2.5-week recovery from an axe flying off its helve hitting him. The fur trade was full of all kinds of dangers, it would appear. During this time, he wrote a letter to his mother that indicated he was feeling very isolated out on the frontier. He asked Lucy, his mother, to tell friends and family to write him, quote, "a long letter about anything or nothing at all," end quote. In 1817, Reuben had become prominent enough a figure to be hired as the Cherokee agent, and I want to provide a little background on what made his position so important. The Cherokee, a tribe originally indigenous to the southeast United States, as is pictured here, so Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, were pressured to relocate to the west, to Arkansas specifically, in order to make room for white settlements. One of the major problems, other than uprooting an entire group of people, is that the land they were relocated to was already owned by the Osage, another tribe. And as you can imagine, this caused some serious tension between the two tribes. Reuben was offered an excellent salary, $1,500, to come in and fix this problem. His time at the Cherokee Agency, I think, really illustrates some of the inherent issues of the relocation of native tribes. When Reuben finally heard about the new territory line for the incoming Cherokee, it would already be far too late. It was already far too late, and the Cherokee had settled everywhere. The United States apparently was growing into its new size still, and was still trying to learn how to communicate effectively over new and vast distances. So pictured here we have John C. Calhoun, which was the Secretary of War at the time and who Reuben Lewis reported to. Also the Arkansas River and Fort Osage, where he served lots of his time. On top of all those things, the issues of slow communication, Reuben often received conflicting reports about where the new boundary should be, and would just refuse to run the boundary until he received a united decision. I think this really illustrates that the country is still only 40 years old and was still learning how to communicate effectively over these vast new distances. Something that I loved about learning about this time of Reuben's life is that he stands out as someone who saw and treated Native Americans as people in a time where that wasn't necessarily the norm. Reuben had jurisdiction over 6,000 Native Americans. and he constantly reminded the Secretary of War in the letters that I read that the U.S. government had not fulfilled their promises to the Cherokee. He complained that the Cherokee had still not received their promised annuity. Also, not all Cherokee had relocated to Arkansas. Some stayed in the southeastern United States, as is pictured here, and were called the Eastern Cherokee. The United States kept making treaties with the Eastern Cherokee and then applying those treaties to the Western Cherokee, or the Cherokee who had voluntarily moved west to Arkansas. Obviously, the Western Cherokee felt unrepresented, and Reuben fought for a delegation of Western Cherokee to be sent to Washington and visit the president so that all native Cherokee voices could be heard. As more Cherokee moved west, Reuben would give them keel boats in order to get to their new land quicker. The U.S. government did not give Reuben official permission to do this, but he did it anyways, because he was moved to compassion by the fact that he said they were almost without provisions, and defended his actions by reminding the government that the president had, after all, promised any facility in moving the Native Americans to their new territory. I was impressed by the fact that he acted when he saw a need instead of waiting for everything to go through the bureaucracy of the time. Travelers who came and visited Reuben would hear him talk about the modernity and accomplishments of the Cherokee, and would in turn then note the Cherokee's relative prosperity under Reuben's guidance. Reuben also unabashedly tell white settlers to get off of the lands promised the natives by the U.S. government. He also noticed a legal gap, that there was no legislation protecting slaves among the Cherokee. He reported to the Secretary of War a sickening event of a Cherokee woman beheading a black slave, and called upon the government to, quote, protect the lives of that poor unfortunate part of the human species, end quote. He also demonstrated an extensive understanding and friendship with the Osage and Cherokee tribes. We have an Osage warrior pictured here, a Cherokee warrior, and then an Osage family as well. He acted as a talented diplomat and facilitated a friendship treaty between the Osage and Cherokee to return all stolen possessions, which at the time consisted mostly of horses and people. He, for a time, ended the age-old tradition of private revenge, and instead the Cherokee and Osage came to Reuben to report incidents, who would then solve them legally. This is rather unheard of. I mean, the Cherokee-Osage rivalry is one of the most famous in all of Native American histories, but under Reuben, they became so close to each other that they even hunted together. He really helped reduce the number of incidents that occurred between the two tribes. At one point, the Cherokee wanted revenge for a recent killing perpetrated by the Osage, but Reuben was able to convince them to wait until an official council could be held. But then Reuben had to leave unexpectedly, which we'll get to in a second. And upon his departure, a full-scale war immediately broke out after he was gone. I think this really illustrates that he had held the peace between these two tribes. And in the absence of his skilled diplomacy, the situation became unsustainable, and the Cherokee and Osage came to fight each other so much that eventually the U.S. government had to even step in. I think in this circumstance, Reuben's actions really stand in stark contrast to a statement made by William Clark in 1817 when he wrote the Secretary of War, and said that a Cherokee-Osage war could be seen as a positive because it would prevent them from attacking white settlers. Reuben was completely unwilling to provoke or allow for such a war, because whatever so-called positive outcomes such a conflict could have, to Reuben it was simply not worth the loss of native life it could cause. I think this whole story is especially moving, considering the fact that Reuben grew up among the Cherokee in Georgia, and there were some incidents of Cherokee murdering whites near where he was living. Despite this assuredly jarring childhood experience, Reuben knew better than to define an entire people by the actions of a few. Despite the fact that he was making a difference and a lot of money, he resigned his position while he was on the frontier after he received a letter I actually just found last week, which is kind of exciting. He heard from a family member. I can't see all of it because the screen is up and I can't also see my mouth, but I will summarize it. Basically, his half-brother, Dr. John Marks, it says that his insanity had obtained a dangerous appearance. I guess you can also read it yourselves. And told Reuben that he would now consider himself the only prop of his family, that his mother's strength was decreasing, and that his brother, who was mentally unstable, had escaped and that no one knew where he was. This must have been simply heartbreaking. Reuben's father, William, his brother, Meriwether, and his half-brother, John Marks, all suffered from mental illness. John Marks died soon after this letter in an asylum. Reuben left as soon as he could after receiving this letter to go take care of his family. He ended up living on a plot of land right next to his mother and marrying his childhood friend. He died an old man in Albemarle County, Virginia. And so I guess as I come to the end of my findings of Reuben Lewis, my question is, should his life matter to us? And if so, why? The American history of the fur trade and of Native American relations are complex and sometimes morally ambiguous. Hopefully, I've demonstrated throughout this presentation that Reuben did not navigate those complicated worlds perfectly. It is so valuable in our stories that we tell the stories of those people who changed, who became better. And from my research, it would appear that this applies to Reuben as well. He has quite the character arc from the beginning to the end. His story is valuable as an example of a man who, to some extent, overcame prejudice and fear to treat people very different from himself with respect and dignity. I think his story excellently complements the memory of Lewis and Clark, and has been an honor and joy to unveil this untold aspect of their story. Thank you very much.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you, thank you. So now is an awesome opportunity for anybody to either unmute themselves to ask Deveney a question or to chat into the chat box and ask a question, whichever you are most comfortable with. So, Dave, I see that you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question?
Yeah, hi, Stephanie. That was great. This is Dave and Marty Peck. And do you know how Reuben died?
Yes, as far as I understand, just of old age. He died, I think, in his 60s. That's as far as I know. I haven't read anything else that has indicated anything other than that.
Did you ever get married?
Margaret Nelson would like to know the date of Reuben's death.
I think it's 1844. I think it's January of 1844, if I remember correctly, just before his birthday. And I think the woman with Dave, I'm assuming that's your wife. You asked if he ever got married. He did marry his childhood friend, as I mentioned, who I didn't mention was also his cousin. It was kind of common at the time. They had no children together, but they did. I think she died a couple of years after him.
Fantastic. Jerry, I see that you unmuted yourself as well. Do you have a question?
I would like to know, did you mention that Meriwether did not go with the Marks family to the Broad River area of Georgia?
Yeah, so there is some historical debate about when Meriwether, or if he went to Georgia at all. Some scholars say that he went to Georgia and stayed there for a couple of years and then returned to Virginia to continue his schooling. And others say that he stayed there right away. I had found some documents that indicated that he was provided with a guardian before the family even left, which leads me to conclude that he perhaps stayed in Virginia instead of going with his family to Georgia.
Okay, there is a marker in that area in Georgia that designates that he was in that area. So that's kind of up in the air then.
Mm-hmm. He did come and visit at some points, I'm sure. And like I said, there are some family lore stories about Meriwether being in Georgia and even his interactions with the Cherokee Indians there. The only thing with family lore, it's sometimes difficult to tell how much of it is completely accurate or not. But yes.
Okay, and I hope I didn't miss it, but were there any other comments that Reuben might have made about Meriwether's death?
That's a really good question. I have looked through pretty much anything I can find that Reuben wrote, and I have found no comments about his death. I'm sure that you're referring to the fact that, for those who don't know, it's unclear whether Meriwether committed suicide or was murdered. The family seemed pretty certain that it was not suicide, that it was murder, while Thomas Jefferson seemed pretty sure that it was suicide. Since I haven't read anything about Reuben specifically, what he said, I would assume that he would agree with his mother and the rest of his family who thought that it was murder.
Video.
Mark Jordan has a comment and maybe a question.
That's an excellent point, Mark. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, being 80 years old, I don't consider myself old yet. So,
oh, no, you are young. I think at the time, maybe the life expectancy was slightly shorter, and maybe something else did happen to Reuben. I haven't heard anything about it yet.
Deveney?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Bernice over here. This might be a little bit weird, but I was wondering, did Reuben ever have any contact or continued any contact, if he did, with York, the slave who his brother continued to keep as a slave, unfortunately, after the expedition, which was really left much to be desired. But in any case, did Reuben have much contact with York, or is there anything written about York in the writings about Reuben?
That's a really good question, Bernice. Sorry, you had one more comment?
No, I was just going to say that last week there was a presentation, I don't know, about York's sister who spoke. It was a very interesting presentation given last week or 2 weeks ago. But beside the point, I've always been interested in York, and because he was such an integral part of that expedition, and yet, Lewis brought up, no, Meriwether Lewis, William brought him back as a slave instead of giving him his freedom, which he should have done. But what I'm getting at is, was there anything that you read, any letters or any comments that Reuben made about it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So as you said, York was the slave of William Clark, and so not of Reuben's brother, Meriwether. And I have read some letters that Reuben wrote while staying at William Clark's house. So I'm sure that he knew York, but that's the only thing I've read about any kind of their interactions.
So he never said anything that you should let him go free or anything of that sort, nothing of that?
No, Reuben himself was a slave owner, so I doubt that.
That's right, at that time. Okay. Thank you very much. Your presentation was excellent. You certainly have a lot of information there. I really didn't know anything about this man, so thank you very much.
Of course, thank you for coming.
Thomas would like to know, are you planning to continue to research his life, or do you have a new project you're working on?
That's also a great question. So Dr. Buckley and I are still working on finalizing this paper we've been working on. We're probably about 3/4 of the way through, so we're hoping to finish it up and get it published.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and you're continuing to travel a little bit, right? So
yes, yeah.
Can you talk anything about what you're expecting to find in your next travels?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm currently in Montana, where it is snowing outside, which is just horrendous in late May. And so I was able to go through the library here, and then I'm going to Three Forks, the site that I talked about to such great extent on Saturday, which I'm also excited to see. I'll be going to St. Louis to visit the Missouri Historical Society, which has lots of interesting documents about the fur trade, and then also to Virginia. The University of Virginia has some interesting things about their early family life, and so hopefully I can shed some more light about Meriwether and Reuben's childhood, which, as we were discussing earlier, is a little bit difficult to pinpoint because no one was famous yet. And so the exact records are a little bit hard to understand, like how true they are, to what extent they're true. And then I'm also hopefully going to be able to see Reuben Lewis's grave near Charlottesville. So that's what's up for next time.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions at this time? Shannon, I see that you have unmuted yourself. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I loved your presentation, by the way. This is kind of my realm sometimes too. So I have, I guess, kind of two questions. One of them's kind of out there, but the first one, so it's interesting because for the expedition, Lewis and Clark at their Fort Mandan, one of the things that Meriwether becomes kind of famous for, even in records kept by British fur trappers, is that when they go over to talk to them, Clark wants to be polite. Lewis immediately cuts to the chase and wants to discuss politics, tells them he hopes their empire fails. Versus when Reuben, I can't remember if it's at Three Forks or somewhere, where some British fur trappers know he's pretty polite. He doesn't say anything. He's super civil. So my question on Reuben is, do you perceive that he's kind of the mellower of the two siblings? And then the second one, I remember reading, and we proceeded on a few years ago, and it had a little bit of an article about Reuben and Manuel Lisa, a few people, mentioning that when Reuben was at Three Forks at the post, there was a Newfoundland dog there. And this probably is completely out there, but when you're doing your research, keep us posted if you find out that Meriwether sent his dog up the river in 1809. We want to know if that's a thing.
That is very interesting. Hopefully I can find a little bit more about the dog when I go through the fur trade archives at the Missouri Historical Society. I'll keep an eye out for that. And as for your first question about just their relative personalities, just from reading their letters, it does appear that Reuben was, I would say, the funnier of the two. We know that Meriwether is pretty serious. And like I said, Reuben kind of liked to jab at Meriwether a little bit or make jokes to his mom about Meriwether. And then also the accounts that I've read of travelers who met Reuben, like Bradbury or Brackenridge or Ludding, if you're familiar with any of those names. Also that he was a very pleasant and mellow man. So I think your assessment is completely correct, Shannon.
I guess I also have a third question. I'm actually going to, I don't know if you've gotten to do research with the Missouri Historical Society yet, but they're fantastic. And maybe if your research dovetails on mine, I'm finishing up an article on Frederick Bates. Have you come across anything of Rueben commenting on him and his brother's rivalry?
On Frederick Bates?
Yeah, if Rueben said anything yet.
I have not read anything that Reuben said, but I have read some things that Meriwether said. And I do understand that they did not get along very well. But I haven't read it. Again, Reuben didn't leave very much behind, which is part of what makes this research process so difficult. He didn't write any journals. The letters that we have of his are pretty few and far between. So I haven't read anything specifically about that.
Thanks.
Bernice?
Can I ask another?
I have
Okay.
compiled information about the Marks family in Georgia. Not good enough for a research paper, of course, but that would probably be an extra 2 or 3 days if you're in Virginia. But if you need directions to where the marker is in Georgia, I can tell you how to get there. It's way back in the boondocks, but but it's a fun drive.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I'll have to get your information from Sarah.
Okay, I'll send it to Sarah, or Sarah can get a hold of me.
You got it. Yeah, I can definitely do that. Bernice, you had a question?
Yeah, I have trouble hearing and my PC is also acting up a little bit. But after all that's said and done, Rueben then comes across as more civil and human with the Native Americans. Is that what I'm trying to get?
Yeah, I definitely noticed that when reading about him. Like I said, he wrote lots of letters to the American government complaining about how the American government was not fulfilling the promises that they had made, when lots of other agents were willing to overlook those unfulfilled promises. And I think that really maybe harks back to when he himself did not keep his promises when he was part of the Missouri Fur Trade, or the Missouri Fur Company. And I think that it really demonstrates that he is a truly dynamic character who changed and became better throughout the course of his life.
Thanks. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. What would be the most outstanding characteristic, quality, or whatever, if you had to list one of Rueben?
Ooh, one. I would say that he was perhaps willing to think outside the box. I think that refers to a couple of different attributes of his. I mean, he was willing to stay in really dangerous places when other people were not able to, were too scared to. He was also able to think about people in different ways, such as the Cherokee, and treat them differently than many of his contemporaries did. So I'd say innovative, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
All right, any other questions, comments? I guess concerns? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, Deveney, for coming out here. I'm so happy to have been able to host you here in Great Falls. It's been such a pleasure. So round of applause from everyone, I am sure. If any other questions do come across that you folks have, please feel free to send them my way. director@lewisandclark.org. I will then pass them on to Deveney. And thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. Stay tuned for further information from Deveney, as I'm sure she will keep us updated, especially about the dog question, but also about future programs and future events hosted by the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation and our regions and chapters. We have a lot of exciting events coming up, so just stay tuned. And if you want to be a part of our email group, please email me and I will put you on all of the groups that I absolutely can. So again, thank you, Deveney. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. And hopefully the rest of you all are staying warm while we in Great Falls freeze a little bit tonight. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be well.